Lecture 3, on Ethics, Contemporary Moral Problems. 1. An Introduction to Kantian Ethics. Our text begins with a very brief overview of Immanuel Kant, pointing out both that he is one of the most important thinkers of all time and a terrible writer. This is a fair assessment. Kant's writing is as insightful as it is bewildering. This, in part, stems from the fact that his works are 18th-century German translated into modern English. However, it is also because his style of writing was an elaborate type of legalese, full of original terminology, and incredibly dense conceptually. What's more, some of his works cover topics that require the reader to have a tremendous capacity for abstract thought. Kant's legal approach to philosophy left an enormous impact on the way philosophy would forever be done in the Western world. Indeed, since Kant, with a few exceptions in various traditions, philosophy has become much more analytical and far less whimsical. Fortunately for us, this is ethics, so we won't have to wrestle with his dizzying metaphysics or go anywhere near his critique of pure reason. You're welcome. However, even though Kant's ethics are typically more accessible than his metaphysics, it is still quite challenging. An interesting and foundational point alluded to in the introduction that distinguishes Kantian ethics from utilitarianism is that, on this view, ethics are grounded in reason, as opposed to pleasure. If you recall, one of the sources of concern for utilitarianism was its grounding in hedonism, which sees the source of morality in pleasure. However, many of the most intense pleasures enjoyed by humans are also enjoyable to animals. Yet animals are amoral creatures, for the specific reason that they are not rational, at least to the degree that humans can be. Therefore, it makes sense to ground morality in reason rather than pleasure, as we will see Kant does. Another foundational difference between Kantian ethics and utilitarianism is that Kantian ethics are deontological, as opposed to consequentialist. Utilitarianism is said to be consequentialist, since it is the consequence of an action that gives that action its moral characterization. On a deontological view, actions receive their moral characterization from some characteristic of the action itself and, on Kant's view, from the agents performing those actions for the sake of duty. But more on this later. 2. Acting for the sake of duty and acting in accordance with duty. For Kant, acting for the sake of duty, though we may desire to do otherwise, is the only way that an action can have moral worth. Our text gives us the example of a friend who donates money to the homeless out of empathy and explains that, for Kant, the action has no moral worth. This is because Kant's view is thought to be grounded in reason or rationality. The friend may have done a good thing by helping the homeless, but the friend did so out of empathy. Essentially, the motivation was to make themselves feel better by helping someone else. For Kant, it would seem that for the friend's action to have moral worth, it would need to be motivated by a rational recognition of our duty to help others, not motivated by a feeling, such as empathy. Acting from a sense of empathy, as in this scenario, is merely acting in accordance with duty and not acting for the sake of duty. Kant has us consider a man that is not empathetic like our friend in the example, but, despite his lack of empathy, he nevertheless tears himself from his deadly insensibility and performs the action without any inclination at all, but solely from duty. Then for the first time his action has genuine moral worth. Since this man is acting from a rational recognition of his duty, and not from a feeling or desire, his action has moral worth, because, again, for Kant, it seems that morality is based in reason and not in feelings or desires. In this case, with no feelings or desires motivating the action, the man is acting only for the sake of duty. 3. Categorical and hypothetical imperatives. An imperative is essentially something that must be done or a command that must be obeyed. Imperatives can be either categorical or hypothetical. An imperative is categorical when it applies to everyone, irrespective of how anyone feels about it. To illustrate this, consider the descriptions big or small. These descriptions are not categorical. A building described as big will be small when compared to a planet, and a planet, while bigger than a building, will be smaller than a galaxy. Therefore, big and small are not categorical. A description of someone as a bachelor, however, is specifically defined and does not admit of degrees. If someone is an unmarried man, then that person is a bachelor. In other words, that person fits into the category of bachelor. They will not cease to be a bachelor when compared to anything else. That person is categorically a bachelor. When imperatives are categorical, they make up the moral law. Our text gives us 3 of Kant's formulations of the categorical imperative. The universalizability principle. Ci 1. Act only according to that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. The formula of humanity. Ci 2. So act that you use humanity, in your own person as well as in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. The kingdom of ends formulation. Ci 3. Every rational being must so act as if he were through his maxim always a lawmaking member in the universal kingdom of ends. Hypothetical imperatives on the other hand are essentially contingent and optional. For example, if you want money, you ought to get a job. This prescription is a conditional statement, if, then, and hypothetical, hence, a hypothetical imperative. 4. The first formulation of the categorical imperative, abbreviated Ci 1, the first categorical imperative formulation instructs us that everything we do should be done as though we were following a rule that we would want to apply to everyone. The example given in the text is of person promising to pay back a loan but lying to the lender. The maxim, or rule of conduct, that this lie is following is something like, whenever I can benefit from making a false promise I should do so. However, this maxim cannot be a universal law because no one would believe, or even make, promises anymore knowing that everyone is supposed to make false promises when it benefits them, so this maxim would be irrational and impermissible. Contrarily, never make false promises, as a maxim, passes the Ci 1 test. 5. Perfect and imperfect duties. This previous example of making false promises demonstrates what Kant calls a contradiction in conception because that maxim cannot be conceived of as a universal law. This is because promises are based on trust, and would not exist under this maxim, so it is contradictory. Since it cannot be conceived of as a universal law, it cannot be willed a universal law. However, since it is a contradiction, it proves that its opposite is true, and that opposite is what Kant calls a perfect duty. In this case, never make false promises, even when it benefits you. If a maxim is not a contradiction in conception, it still may be what Kant calls a contradiction in will. For example, even though we can conceive of a universal law that says do not help those in need, no one would want that because everyone needs help sometimes, making it an imperfect duty. 6. Second formulation of the categorical imperative, abbreviated in our text as Ci 2, Kant's second formulation basically states that, in your behavior, you ought to always treat everyone, including yourself, as an end, and never just as a means to something else. In short, don't use people. Using people is to reduce them to the moral standing of mere objects instead of treating them as rational agents, which people are, and, to Kant, this is morally wrong. Recall, on Kant's view, morality is grounded in rationality. 7. The third formulation of the categorical imperative, abbreviated Ci 3, the third formulation seems to combine the first two, saying that we ought to act as though we are creating moral laws with our behavior that everyone will have to follow. Ci 1 gives us a method for generating maxims that do not have exceptions to guide our behavior, and Ci 2 tells us to treat everyone as ends in themselves. So the maxims of Ci 3 will be generated from Ci 1 and must adhere to Ci 2. Kant's view provides us with a moral calculus instead of a mere list of rules because situations can be unique and ever-changing. There will likely be situations in the future that are impossible right now, so we couldn't possibly come up with rules to cover them. For example, 50 years ago we wouldn't have been able to establish rules for ethical online behavior because, at the time, there was no internet. Therefore, when looking at contemporary moral problems through Kant's ethical lens, the categorical imperative serves us in our moral calculus to rationally evaluate situations on a case-by-case basis. 8. Kant on suicide. As said in the text, Kant gives very few examples in his writing, but when he does, it is worthwhile to examine them. Kant treats suicide quite harshly, so I will not replicate his exact words here as is done in our text. A general conceptual overview will suffice for this discussion. Kant applies the categorical imperative to suicide and receives a similar result to that of false promises discussed earlier. Just as the false promise maxim failed the CI1 test since it resulted in a contradiction, namely that the false promise maxim destroys the trust that is necessary for promising, so too does suicide result in a contradiction. On Kant's view, suicide is pursued out of self-love. The idea being that since a person loves themselves, they pursue suicide as a way to spare themselves some pain or suffering. However, for Kant, the idea that self-love could lead to intentional self-destruction is contradictory, so the opposite of the suicide maxim must be true, making one should not commit suicide a perfect duty and moral law. Many are not swayed by Kant's line of argument here, however, since it is unclear that people always pursue suicide out of self-love, so it is also unclear as to whether there is actually a contradiction. It is also suggested that a suicide maxim fails CI2, as suicide seems at odds with treating oneself as an end in oneself. However, this is not perfectly clear either. 9. Problems and responses, conflicting duties. Coincidentally, our text gives a similar example to the one we discussed in the chapter on utilitarianism. Nazis come to your door looking for your friends whom you've hidden and ask you if you know where they are. As a Kantian, does this mean you have a duty not to lie to the Nazis, dooming your friends? It is not clear how far Kant's moral objectivism, or absolutism, goes in cases like this, since Kant never discussed them. However, according to Peter Rickman, it should be plain that more than one imperative moral principle is relevant to the situation. Certainly we should tell the truth, but do we not also have a duty to protect an innocent man from harm? Further, do we not have an obligation to fight evil? We are confronted with a conflict of values here. Unfortunately, as far as I know, there is no explicit discussion of this issue in Kant. One could assume, however, that his general approach of distinguishing the lesser from the greater evil should be applied. I think Kant might say that although lying is never right, it might be the lesser evil in some cases. The takeaway here is that Kant's theory is underspecified, but this may be an advantage. For example, Socrates never published anything, presumably because he wanted people to think for themselves, and not merely adopt his ideas. Similarly, Kant's intention may have been to provide us the supreme principle of morality and a general method of moral calculus, but has left it up to us to work out what to do in unique situations. 10. Problems and responses, the role of intuitions. As can be seen from the Nazi example, there are times that Kant's moral calculus produces counterintuitive results. And, as has already been said, on a strong absolutist view, it would seem to render his method repugnant, but on a lesser of two evils view, it seems to retain its insight. However, as the text asks, what role, if any, should intuitions have in the formation and the testing of moral theory? 11. Problems and responses, categorical imperatives and etiquette. While some philosophers agree that morality is a collection of categorical imperatives, whether this is due to reason is controversial. For example, Philippa Foot did not believe that, simply by reasoning well, we could figure out every moral law. Foot's example of etiquette is helpful here. Our text tells a story of a sportsman who attends a funeral in a tracksuit. When confronted, his excuse is that it's what he likes wearing. However, his preference, or desire, to wear tracksuits doesn't change the fact that he really ought not have worn a tracksuit to a funeral. Rules of etiquette are categorical because they are not dependent on anyone's desires. However, you probably can't figure out all the rules of etiquette by reason alone either. Indeed, we come to learn them in the course of shared cultural practices, which might also be the case for morality. 12. Problems and responses, the domain of morality. A final issue to consider is the rationalist idea that morality arises from reason and only concerns agents who reason. Even though Kant would say we shouldn't abuse animals because doing so would make it more likely that we would treat humans that way, his view is that animal abuse itself is not immoral. However, it seems as though it does have a moral aspect even on Kant's view because it is morally damaging to the person abusing animals, in that, it makes them more likely to treat people that way, which is overtly moral for Kant. 13. Summary. As our text says, Kant's moral theory is extremely complicated and badly expressed. However, it is hugely influential and profound. As a system builder, Kant's work starts with rational reflection from which he attempts to develop a complete moral system. He starts from the notion of duty. He shows that what allows us to act for the sake of duty is the goodwill, and that the goodwill is unconditionally good. If we want to act for the sake of duty, we need to act out of respect for the moral law, and this amounts to following the categorical imperative. Kant argues that in following the categorical imperative, agents will converge on what is morally permissible. Hence Kant can talk about absolute and objective moral truths. 14. Questions and tasks. While the issues to consider section presents 10 questions, please at least answer the following questions before next time. 1. Do you think that there are things you ought to do irrespective of your desires and inclinations? 2. Can you think of some examples where you might be treating someone solely as means to an end? 3. How might Ci2 relate to prostitution? Do you think that Kant would say that it is morally permissible? 4. Why might Kant's theory be well placed to respect people's rights? Before we end our discussion, let us use a thought experiment to get some practice with Kant's ethical lens. Imagine Jack is married to Jill, but Lilith wants Jack for herself. So, one day while Jill is out of town, Lilith visits Jack hoping to initiate an intimate encounter and eventually get him to leave Jill for her. Let's analyze this situation for both Jack and Lilith using Kant's ethical lens and his prescribed moral calculus. If Jack agrees to the encounter, the maxim he is endorsing is something like, never turn down an opportunity to cheat on your spouse. For Lilith, the maxim she would be endorsing is something like, always try to seduce married people you find attractive. Let's now test these with Ci1, the universalizability principle. If everyone knew it was a rule to never turn down an opportunity to cheat on your spouse, the institution of marriage as we know it, and meaning, would not exist as it does, so this points to a contradiction, similar to the false promise example. For Lilith's part, if everyone knew that you should never turn down an opportunity to cheat on your spouse, and that you should always try to seduce married people you find attractive, it would form another contradiction because she would be making her own goal of keeping him for herself impossible, since marriage would have eroded socially, and cheating would be required at every opportunity. Now let's turn to Ci2, the formula of humanity. If they gave into the urge to commit adultery, it isn't 100% clear that they are using each other merely as means to ends, but it certainly does appear so, the end being sexual gratification. Since these maxims fail tests 1 and 2, they certainly fail 3 as well, and therefore, the moral calculus produces the opposite of these maxims, in the form of perfect duties. Always turn down opportunities to cheat on your spouse and never try to seduce married people you find attractive. As you learn to use Kant's ethical lens and moral calculus, consider using them to examine other contemporary moral problems that are important to you. For example, consider Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the conscription of civilians into the Russian army. What would the maxims be and what would result when applying categorical imperative formulation Ci1 and 2?